What if I told you that Saudi Arabia buried millions of gallons of salt water beneath their desert sand and created underground rivers in a land that hasn't seen natural rivers for millions of years? That they built a water network longer than the Nile River running completely underground through one of the driest places on Earth? It sounds like an impossible engineering fantasy, right? Like something from a science fiction movie about terraforming alien planets. Well, Saudi Arabia actually did this. And the results are so remarkable that they've transformed not just the kingdom itself, but how the entire world thinks about water security in desert regions. This is that incredible story. But to understand why Saudi Arabia would attempt such an ambitious and seemingly impossible project, we need to understand the scale of the water crisis they were facing. A crisis so severe that it threatened the very survival of one of the world's wealthiest nations. Picture Saudi Arabia. 2.15 million square kilometers of mostly desert. That's roughly the size of Mexico, covered almost entirely by sand. The Arabian Peninsula is one of the driest regions on Earth, receiving less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year in most areas. Some regions go years without seeing a single drop of rain. For most of human history, this wasn't necessarily a crisis. The Arabian Peninsula was sparsely populated by nomadic tribes who had adapted to extreme water scarcity over thousands of years. They knew where to find the rare oases, how to conserve water, and how to survive on minimal resources. But everything changed with the discovery of oil in the 1930s. Suddenly, Saudi Arabia went from being a poor desert kingdom to one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. With oil wealth came rapid population growth, massive urban development, and a complete transformation of lifestyle. By the 1970s, Saudi Arabia's population was exploding. Cities like Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dammam were growing at unprecedented rates. Millions of people were moving from traditional desert lifestyles to modern urban environments that required enormous amounts of water. Modern cities need water for everything: drinking, cooking, cleaning, air conditioning, industrial processes, and maintaining green spaces. A single person in a modern city uses hundreds of times more water than a traditional desert nomad. But Saudi Arabia's natural water resources hadn't changed. They still had virtually no rainfall, no rivers, no lakes. The underground aquifers that had sustained small populations for centuries were completely inadequate for modern urban populations. By the 1980s, Saudi Arabia was facing a water crisis that threatened to limit their development and prosperity. Cities were growing faster than water supplies could be secured. Economic development was being constrained by water availability. The kingdom's leaders realized they needed revolutionary solutions. Traditional approaches to water scarcity weren't sufficient. Water conservation could help, but couldn't bridge the massive gap between supply and demand. Importing water was prohibitively expensive and logistically impossible at the scale required. The Saudi government initially tried to develop agriculture using underground fossil water sources. Massive circular irrigation systems were built in the desert, creating green agricultural zones that were visible from space. For a while, Saudi Arabia even became a wheat exporter, but this approach was fundamentally unsustainable. The fossil water they were using had accumulated over thousands of years and wasn't being replenished. Scientists calculated that at the rate they were using it, these water sources would be exhausted within decades. By the 1990s, it was clear that Saudi Arabia needed to find renewable water sources that could provide reliable water indefinitely, not just for a few decades. That's when they began looking seriously at the ocean that surrounded much of their territory. Saudi Arabia has over 2,600 kilometers of coastline, along the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The ocean contained unlimited water, but it was salt water that was undrinkable without treatment. The technology to remove salt from seawater existed, but it was expensive and energy intensive. However, Saudi Arabia had one crucial advantage: abundant, cheap energy from their oil resources. What was expensive and impractical for most countries was potentially feasible for a nation with some of the world's largest oil reserves. The decision was made to invest heavily in desalination technology. But this was just the beginning of the challenge. Even if they could produce fresh water from seawater, how would they distribute it across a country the size of Mexico, much of which was empty desert? Traditional water distribution systems wouldn't work. Surface canals would lose enormous amounts of water to evaporation in the extreme heat. Above-ground pipelines would be vulnerable to sandstorms, extreme temperatures, and sabotage. That's when Saudi engineers proposed something that had never been attempted on such a scale: building an underground water distribution network that would span the entire country. Not just local distribution systems, but a national water grid running beneath the desert sand. The concept was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in water management. They would build massive desalination plants along the coast, then transport the fresh water through underground pipelines to cities and developments hundreds of kilometers inland. But the scale of the proposed project was staggering. The pipeline network would need to stretch over 8,700 miles when fully completed. That's longer than the Nile River, which is the longest natural river on Earth. They were proposing to build the longest water transport system in human history and hide it completely underground. Critics were skeptical from the beginning. Engineers questioned whether such a massive underground system could be built and maintained in desert conditions. Economists worried about the enormous costs. Environmental groups raised concerns about the impact of massive desalination operations. International water experts called the project unrealistic and potentially wasteful. Some described it as, quote, burying money in the sand, and predicted that the harsh desert conditions would make maintenance impossible. But Saudi Arabia's leadership was committed to the project. They understood that without a revolutionary approach to water security, their economic development and population growth would be severely constrained. The decision was made to proceed with what would become the largest water infrastructure project in human history. Construction began in the early 2000s, with the development of massive desalination facilities along Saudi Arabia's coastlines. These weren't small treatment plants, but industrial complexes designed to process millions of gallons of seawater daily. The desalination technology itself was revolutionary. Traditional desalination was extremely energy-intensive and produced large amounts of toxic brine waste. Saudi engineers developed new approaches that were more efficient and environmentally sustainable. Advanced reverse osmosis. Systems could remove salt and other impurities while using less energy than previous methods. Solar power integration reduced reliance on fossil fuels. Innovative brine management systems minimized environmental impact. But the real engineering challenge was the underground distribution network. Pipelines had to be designed to withstand extreme temperature variations, from scorching surface heat to stable underground conditions. Materials had to resist corrosion from both the water being transported and the harsh chemical environment of desert soils. The logistics of construction were extraordinary. Crews had to dig trenches and install pipelines across hundreds of kilometers of desert. Much of the work had to be done during limited cooler periods to protect workers from extreme heat. Advanced tunneling equipment was brought in to handle rocky terrain and sand that could shift and bury work sites overnight. GPS and satellite technology were essential for maintaining accurate pipeline routes across featureless desert landscapes. Quality control was critical because repairs would be extremely difficult and expensive once the system was operational. Every joint, every valve, every section of pipeline had to be installed perfectly the first time. By 2010, the first sections of Saudi Arabia's underground water network were becoming operational. The initial results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The system was delivering fresh water reliably across vast distances with minimal losses. But the real breakthrough came with the integration of smart monitoring technology. Sensors throughout the underground network could detect pressure changes, leaks, and quality issues in real time. Automated systems could adjust flow rates and routing to optimize efficiency. The buried pipeline network wasn't just delivering water, it was maintaining consistent pressure and quality across the entire system. Water arriving in Riyadh from coastal desalination plants was as fresh and clean as water being delivered to cities just a few kilometers from the production facilities. The reliability of the system was remarkable. Unlike surface water systems that could be disrupted by storms, conflicts, or sabotage, the underground network was protected from virtually all external threats. The desert sand that seemed like an obstacle had become a protective barrier. Temperature stability was another unexpected benefit. While surface temperatures in Saudi Arabia can exceed 50 degrees Celsius, underground temperatures remain relatively constant year-round. This stability reduced stress on the pipeline materials and helped maintain water quality. The success of the initial system led to rapid expansion. By 2015, underground pipelines were reaching previously uninhabitable areas of the desert. New cities and developments were being planned in locations that would have been impossible without the water security provided by the underground network. The economic impact was transformational. Industries that required large amounts of water could now operate in Saudi Arabia. Petrochemical complexes, manufacturing facilities, and technology centers were being built in locations chosen for factors other than water availability. Urban development accelerated dramatically. Cities like Riyadh expanded far beyond their traditional boundaries. New communities were being built in areas that had been empty desert just years earlier. The agricultural potential was equally remarkable. While Saudi Arabia had largely abandoned its unsustainable fossil water farming, the new renewable water supply allowed for the development of modern, efficient agricultural systems. Advanced irrigation technology, combined with reliable water supplies, enabled the cultivation of crops that had never been grown commercially in Saudi Arabia. Greenhouse complexes and hydroponic systems could operate efficiently with guaranteed water access. But perhaps most importantly, the underground water network provided water security. Saudi Arabia was no longer vulnerable to water shortages that could threaten economic development or population growth. The kingdom had achieved true water independence. The success of Saudi Arabia's underground water system began attracting international attention. Delegations from water-scarce countries around the world were visiting to study the technology and implementation strategies. Countries in the Middle East were particularly interested. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and other Gulf states began developing their own underground water networks based on Saudi innovations. But the appeal extended far beyond the Middle East. Australia, with its vast arid interior, began studying how similar systems might support development in previously uninhabitable areas. Countries in Africa facing water scarcity challenges saw potential applications for their own situations. The technology was being adapted for different geographic and economic conditions. Smaller-scale systems could provide water security for individual cities or regions. Integrated renewable energy systems could make the technology viable even for countries without oil resources. International water management companies began licensing Saudi technologies and engineering expertise. The underground water network approach was being standardized and packaged for implementation in different environments. By 2020, variations of Saudi Arabia's underground water system were operating in over 20 countries. The concept of burying water infrastructure to protect it from harsh surface conditions was becoming standard practice in arid regions. The environmental benefits were becoming clear as well. Underground water systems had much lower evaporation losses than surface alternatives. The protected infrastructure required less maintenance and had longer operational lifespans. Desalination technology continued to improve, driven by the massive scale of Saudi operations. More efficient processes, renewable energy integration, and better waste management were making seawater desalination increasingly sustainable. The brine waste from desalination, once considered a major environmental problem, was being converted into valuable commercial products. Salt, minerals, and other byproducts were creating additional revenue streams that helped offset system operating costs. Water recycling and reuse systems were being integrated with the underground network. Treated wastewater could be reintroduced into the system for non-drinking uses, further improving overall efficiency. Smart city technologies were being built around the water infrastructure. Real-time monitoring, predictive maintenance, and automated optimization were making the systems increasingly efficient and reliable. The social impact was profound. Access to reliable water supplies improved public health, supported economic development, and enabled lifestyle improvements that had been impossible under water scarcity conditions. Educational and research institutions were being established to study and improve water management technologies. Saudi Arabia was becoming a global center for water security innovation. The success was also changing perceptions about desert development. Regions that had been considered permanently uninhabitable were now seen as potential areas for sustainable development. Climate change considerations were making the Saudi approach even more relevant. As traditional water sources became less reliable due to changing weather patterns, underground water networks provided stability and security. The technology was being scaled up for even more ambitious projects. Regional networks connecting multiple countries were being planned. International cooperation on water security was being built around shared underground infrastructure. By 2023, Saudi Arabia's underground water network had grown to over 10,000 kilometers of pipelines, making it the largest water distribution system in the world. The network was supplying water to over 30 million people and countless industrial and agricultural operations. The system's capacity continued to expand with new desalination facilities and distribution routes. Plans were in development for networks that would eventually cover the entire Arabian Peninsula. International recognition of the project's success was widespread. Water management organizations, engineering societies, and environmental groups were acknowledging the Saudi underground network as one of the most significant infrastructure achievements of the 21st century. Economic returns were extraordinary. Conservative estimates suggested that the water infrastructure had enabled hundreds of billions of dollars in economic development that would have been impossible without water. Security. The project was also contributing to regional stability. Water security reduced potential conflicts over scarce resources and enabled cooperation on shared development projects. Research and development investments were driving continuous improvements. New materials, monitoring technologies, and efficiency improvements were being tested and implemented regularly. The integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning was optimizing system performance in real time. Predictive algorithms could anticipate maintenance needs, optimize water distribution, and minimize energy consumption. Renewable energy systems were providing an increasing share of the power needed for desalination and distribution. Solar installations in the desert were generating clean electricity for water production. The success of Saudi Arabia's buried water system was inspiring even more ambitious projects. Plans for underground water networks spanning entire continents were being developed by international development organizations. The global impact of Saudi Arabia's underground water innovation was becoming impossible to ignore. By 2024, the technology and principles developed in the Saudi system were being implemented on every continent. In Australia, the vast arid interior was being opened for development, using underground water networks connecting coastal desalination plants to inland areas. Mining operations, agricultural projects, and even new cities were being planned around guaranteed water supplies. African nations were implementing underground water systems to support urban development and drought resilience. Countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt were building their own versions of the Saudi network to support growing populations and economic development. South American countries with large arid regions were adapting the technology for their specific conditions. Chile's Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, was being considered for development using underground water infrastructure. Even countries with traditionally adequate water supplies were implementing underground systems for security and efficiency reasons. Climate change was making traditional water sources less reliable, and buried infrastructure provided protection from extreme weather events. The economic model was being refined for different economic conditions. International development banks were financing underground water projects in developing countries. Public-private partnerships were making the technology accessible to nations that couldn't afford the massive upfront investments. Standardized system designs were reducing costs and implementation time. Modular components could be manufactured at scale and adapted for local conditions. International engineering firms were specializing in underground water network construction. The technology was also being integrated with other infrastructure projects. Underground utility corridors could carry water, power, telecommunications, and other services in protected environments. Smart city developments were being built around integrated underground infrastructure. Research institutions worldwide were studying and improving the technology. Universities were offering specialized programs in underground water management. International conferences were sharing innovations and best practices. The environmental benefits were being quantified and recognized. Underground water systems use significantly less energy and water than alternative approaches. They also had much smaller surface footprints, preserving natural landscapes. Climate adaptation strategies increasingly included underground water infrastructure. As surface water sources became less reliable due to changing precipitation patterns, buried systems provided stable alternatives. The success was also driving innovation in related technologies. Advanced materials, monitoring systems, automation, and renewable energy were all benefiting from developments driven by underground water applications. Water security was being recognized as a foundation for sustainable development. The Saudi model demonstrated that engineering solutions could overcome natural resource limitations and enable development in previously impossible locations. International cooperation on water security was increasing. Shared underground networks were being planned to connect neighboring countries and provide mutual support during emergencies. The geopolitical implications were significant. Countries with water security had advantages in economic development, population growth, and regional influence. Water infrastructure was becoming as important as military or economic power. Looking toward the future, experts were predicting that underground water networks would become standard infrastructure in most of the world's arid regions. The technology was mature, proven, and economically viable. Advances in automation and artificial intelligence were making the systems increasingly efficient and reliable. Future networks would require minimal human intervention while providing optimal performance. Integration with renewable energy was making the systems increasingly sustainable. Solar and wind power could provide clean energy for desalination and distribution, creating completely sustainable water supplies. The potential for expansion was enormous. Conservative estimates suggested that underground water networks could eventually supply water to billions of people in regions that currently lack reliable access. New applications were being developed continuously. Underground water systems could support agriculture in food-insecure regions, enable mining in remote areas, and provide emergency water supplies during disasters. The success of Saudi Arabia's buried water system was proving that human engineering could overcome seemingly impossible natural limitations. What had started as a desperate response to water, scarcity had become a model for sustainable development in the world's harshest environments, from burying millions of gallons of salt water beneath the sand to creating one of the world's most advanced water distribution systems. Saudi Arabia's transformation demonstrated the power of ambitious thinking and innovative engineering. The underground rivers that now flow beneath the Arabian desert didn't just solve Saudi Arabia's water crisis. They created a blueprint for water security that is transforming how desert nations approach development and inspiring water solutions around the world. What other seemingly impossible infrastructure challenges do you think could be solved with similarly innovative approaches? What other natural limitations might be overcome through ambitious engineering projects? Let me know in the comments below.